Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2 for the 5th mission of the US Marine campaign. In the last mission we broke out of the Marine beachhead around Tartus and Al Hamadiya, and we are now attacking the Syrian 5th Airborne Regiment head on as they attempt to defend the Homs Gap. The Marines' avenue of advance is following Highway 3 into the rolling hills of the Gap, bringing us up to the village of Arzu Daraj. Just beyond the village, highways 1 and 3 intersect, with 3 carrying on to the city of Tal Kalak and 1 bypassing it to the north, making the village a key junction. That's why the Syrians have made the decision to defend it. It's certainly not bad defensive terrain. The village itself is very dispersed, with a random patchwork of buildings and compounds scattered over a mostly open plateau. The village's main feature is an intersection where Highway 3 is crossed by a secondary road. This has been hit hard by coalition air power, but constitutes the Marines' main objective, designated Objective K-Bar, and worth 500 points. 2 compounds have been designated as secondary objectives. Objective Frag, beyond K-Bar on the left, is worth 100 points, and Objective Boot, in front and to the right of K-Bar, is worth 200. These 3 objectives represent a cluster around the left centre of the map. Off in the far right corner on the other side of the village is Objective Bayonet, worth 300 points. Beyond this, we have 100 points on the table for inflicting more than 50% casualties on the enemy, another 50 available for neutralising HQ elite commanders, whatever they are, and a final 200 points for keeping Marine casualties below 20%. The briefing suggests the enemy force consists of a company group from the Syrian 5th Airborne, possibly backed up by T-62 tanks from the Syrian 10th Mechanized Division. It's important not to focus on the airborne designation here. Syrian Airborne are more of an elite, or at least elite by Syrian standards, mechanized infantry formation. They are not light infantry who have deployed via helicopter or parachute. They ride into battle in and fight alongside BMP-3s. The BMP-3 is heavily armed, with a 100mm gun and a coaxial 30mm cannon, but lightly armoured and packed full of ammunition. Given the opportunity, it's a serious threat, so they're a priority target along with any enemy tanks. The Syrians have been pounded by air power and are templated to be at about 80% strength, but they could well be reinforced with local irregulars. The briefing makes a point of noting that, while the enemy's ability to manoeuvre at higher levels has been strangled by coalition air dominance, they are still capable of low-level tactical manoeuvre and may well seek to close the range with attacking Marines in order to make calling in air support more difficult. Up against this Syrian force, the Marines are bringing a heavily reinforced company of their own. At the start of the battle, the MEU's sniper, combined anti-armour and LAV platoons are all on map and ready to go. Following them up at 10 minutes, we have the Marines tank platoon, Echo Company in AAVs at the 15-minute mark, and a platoon from Fox Company at 20 minutes, with the MEU's command element trailing in at 30. In terms of support, 2 sections of 81mm mortars and 1 section of 155mm howitzers are available from the start of the battle, being joined by a pair of Cobras at the 10-minute mark, and a second 155mm section once they're done relocating, which should be in about 30 minutes time. This is a force with plenty of firepower and mass, but the briefing does rather ominously say the supply situation is not as good as we would like. Do not be afraid to use what you need to accomplish the mission, but don't waste assets if you don't have to. That's not something I'm going to let interfere with my planning. It's currently 04:45, sunrise is at 05:30, and there are 2 hours on the clock, so we have another dawn scenario. With that much time and poor visibility to start, this seems like another mission that's going to lend itself to an extended recce and preparatory fires phase, followed by a last-minute surge onto the objectives. There's a hill on my left that looks like it offers excellent views over Arzu Daraj. I'm going to call that Dirt Hill, because it's covered in dirt, and I think it's going to be a critical chunk of terrain to first find, and then to suppress and destroy the enemy. It's perhaps a little too early to really nail down an avenue of approach. I have plenty of time to map out the Syrian defences and then make a decision, but I'm already eyeing up a punch down the left flank. Supported by a base of fire on Dirt Hill, advancing on this flank to secure Objective Frag will involve neutralising the enemy in Objectives K-Bar and Boot, making them easier to deal with once Frag is under control and I can hook in across the highway. I'm always looking for ways to compartmentalise the battlefield. Attacking up the left like this means that enemy defenders on the right, and to some extent in the centre, will be out of the fight if they remain static. If they don't, if the enemy mounts a counterattack, then I should be able to engage them in the more open ground outside the village in the centre and on the right. Of course, this is all entirely tentative at this stage. I have options. The first thing I need to do is establish which of those options are viable, and then see if any of them are attractive out the gates, or they need some massaging via the medium of firepower. The sniper teams are already in position 300 meters forward of my deployment zone, and immediately start making spots when the game starts. It looks like the Syrians are dug in along the edge of the village, complete with trenches and concrete bunkers, backed up by a cluster of BMP-3 and T-62s around objective K-bar. There are at least 5 BMP-3s on the left, including 3 that have already been knocked out by coalition air power, which feeds into my original intention to push left. This might seem counterintuitive, especially when peeking one of the LAVs over the crest of Dirt Hill attracts the attention of an AT-14 Cornet team dug in by the broken bridge. The AT-14 is the Syrians' top-of-the-range ATGM, complete with thermal optics, a very serious threat to everything in my force. But conversely, it's also the Syrians' strongest asset. Along with the BMP-3s and tanks, they form the core of the enemy's combat power. If I can smash that, the rest of the Syrian blocking force should be much easier to deal with. I certainly have the capability to smash it. The trick is doing so on my terms and at low risk to my Marines. The key here is Dirt Hill. This position overlooks the village and especially objective K-bar. The sniper teams that started there are already doing vital spotting work. But it's not exactly plain sailing up on the crest. To begin with, the area is extensively cultivated, but as yet unplanted. The locals have ploughed up some of their fields in preparation, creating deep, muddy strips that are proving to be a challenge. One LAV has already gotten stuck trying to get to the crest of Dirt Hill, and it's soon joined by the sniper's Humvee trying to get back down to relay small teams up. Even when they do get up there, it's hardly safe. Obviously the LAVs and Humvees are somewhat easily spotted by the Syrians below them, so I'm trying to keep them out of the way. But it quickly turns out that the infantry teams up there are vulnerable as well. One of the sniper teams, plinking at the spotted AT-14 crew with their M82A3 50 caliber rifle, attract a BMP-3's 100mm high explosive shell for their trouble. A few minutes later, as I probe past Dirt Hill with the LAV dismounts, the same BMP-3 cuts down 2 of them with 30mm cannon fire, and spotting rounds from enemy mortars start to drop nearby. This is at least a two-way street. I have 4 Excalibur precision rounds for my 155s and put 2 into the AT-14 trench, then aim the other 2 at the offending BMP. They're not quite direct hits when they come in, but they're close enough to shred the IFV and put it out of action. Not long after, while Dirt Hill gets mortared, the Cobras arrive and get stuck into the enemy around objective K-bar. For this mission, the Cobras are packing Hellfire missiles, and they quickly start to rack up the kills on enemy armoured vehicles and bunkers. The Abrams have turned up at the same time. I split them into 2 pairs, leaving one to watch down the highway while the other heads up the Dirt Hill. With their tracks, they have a lot less trouble with all the mud than the wheeled LAVs and Humvees. With some reinforcements, and my forces steadily creeping forward on the far left, we get another round in the asset deletion competition. One of the CAAT Humvees eats an AT-14 from across the map. This new ATGM team is on the top floor of a building in the middle of the village, but it's been instantly spotted by one of the overwatching Abrams, which puts a 120mm heat shell directly into it. The team ceases to be a problem. At the same time, it looks like the AT-14 by the bridge is still in the fight. Spotted by the leading dismount, I suppress the position with 25mm cannon fire from the LAVs, but the team is ultimately wiped out by a long burst of 20mm fire from one of the Cobras. After 40 minutes of this, I'm not seeing a lot of contacts. I am attracting plenty of mortar fire though, and a key component of the challenge here is advancing down that left flank slowly enough to minimise the risk of bumping into enemy troops holed up in the buildings, but fast enough to avoid getting hit by enemy fires. On the whole, I have such a light force out in front, mostly the LAV dismount teams, and they're spread so thin then I'm willing to take my time and soak up the casualties and risk from the mortars. This doesn't end well for the Humvee knocked out by the AT-14, and the Marines suffer losses as they probe forward, but the enemy is relentlessly expending ammunition on them and not on my rifle platoons, which, having arrived, are waiting on the reverse slope to exploit. Before they can though, enemy reinforcements show up. The scouts spot T-62 tanks appearing at the back of the map. These attempt to roll up to objective K-bar, but find themselves immediately engaged by the Abrams. The Syrian tankers never get a shot off. What was no doubt intended as a significant armoured counterattack by a couple of platoons disintegrates into a footnote. With that little interlude out of the way, the advance continues. More enemy contacts pop up and engage from the other side of the highway, only to be vigorously mortared and neutralised. When the scouts have proved a route as far as the main street leading to the intersection, I start to bring up a rifle platoon. This is risky. They're coming up in lightly armoured AAVs, but I've been stomping on everything trying to cover this flank for almost an hour now. They get through and dump out the Marines inside, who I quickly start filtering into the village by fire teams, clearing buildings and locking down fields of fire. A little like the advance up to this point, the struggle again is finding the right balance between risk and speed. I don't want to be running Marines through the streets and alleyways without mutual support, but I also need to keep ahead of the enemy's mortars. There are Syrian troops in this section of the village. One team RPGs an LAV and knocks it out. They don't last very long after that, but they prove that I need to be concerned about enemy infantry as much as I need to be concerned about enemy fires. The Marines chew down the street, leapfrogging from building to building, finding enemy troops and smothering them with small arms fire. The advance pauses again when they spot a defilated BMP-3 still up and running, but this is quickly dealt with by flattening the building it's hiding behind and hitting it with a torrent of anti-tank weapons. By now it's getting light. This evens the playing field somewhat, but also allows my forces on Dirt Hill to provide much more effective overwatch. Exploiting this, I run more AAVs through to bring the remaining elements of the lead platoon forward, and even punch one of the highway Abrams across to join them. There's still scattered enemy resistance, a few small teams surviving between my Marines and objective K-bar do their futile best, and the tow Humvee I've left on the highway is knocked out by enemy mortars, but I'm starting to get more concerned about time. Securing the left of K-bar and dominating the far side has almost brought me 3/4 of the way through the battle. With a few small teams and an LAV moving in on objective frag against no apparent opposition, and the platoon I've used to clear the left having culminated, I decide to bring a second platoon into the fight. Getting them up fast enough to make a difference in the final half hour can only involve an AAV bum rush down the highway. Compared to trying to strike elsewhere against an unknown level of resistance that I'm not well positioned to deal with, I'm reasonably sure the highway is safe. The Marines' ultimate destination, the K-bar intersection, is already secure and the route is well covered. The plan is to punch along the road surface as fast as possible, then swing right and resume the axis of attack against objective boot. Supported by a smoke mission from the howitzers, the rush goes off almost without a hitch. With 2 AAVs peeling off to maintain a good deal of dispersion, the lead vehicle pulls up under the bridge. As the Marines inside pour out and start to head up the side of the cutting, they come under fire from their rear. There's another AT-14 team dug in on the opposite side of the highway that has somehow escaped notice until now. The Marines take a casualty, but return fire. It's a terrible position for the AT-14, with a field of fire measured in tens of meters, so they might have fled into that trench trying to get out of the village. Wherever they came from, they're quickly suppressed, they take some casualties, and are gunned down as they try and escape again. With that minor hiccup dealt with, it's on to objective boot. This was a fairly substantial set of buildings inside a walled compound, but I've been pummeling it with the 1.5s and it's getting a little bit rough around the edges. There are a few enemy teams still hanging around, mostly special forces, that take pot shots as the Marines edge closer through the trenches and buildings that overlook the highway. I can see some irregulars trying to reinforce from the right, but I'm also able to rain 40mm grenades on them from the AAVs until they change their minds. Muscling in on objective boot is essentially a rerun of the previous advances, except the enemy mortars have stopped. I have an entire Marine platoon stacked up against this objective. Whenever the enemy puts their heads up, they get smothered with fire. Whenever something pops up that the Marines look like they might have the slightest amount of trouble with, I turn the firepower dial up with the supporting assets back on the other side of the highway or up on Dirt Hill. When the 155s collapse a building in Objective Boot, revealing a new pair of BMP-3s, an Abrams is standing by to knock one out. The other is harder for the support to spot, but the Marines nail it with a small. When the first fire team enters the objective compound and dives in a crater, they come under fire from two buildings off on their right. These are deluged with fire, suppressing the Syrian special forces inside until they're neutralised. Occupying Objective Boot seems to kick off another counterattack by the remaining Syrian airborne. Filtering through the village from the right flank, these are confronted with not only a blocking barrage from the howitzers and mortars, but most of the attacking Marine platoon set up in the buildings waiting for them. The Syrians who survived quickly think better of it. With 11 minutes to go and objectives Frag, K-Bar and Boot secure, the enemy surrender, but I'm confident I was there without the white flag going up. This mission was certainly not as smooth sailing as the last one. I've suffered 23 casualties and lost an LAV, a Mark 19 Humvee and a tow Humvee. Maybe not a massive price given the timescale and the terrain, but one I might feel later if those vehicles don't get replaced. The Syrians have naturally come off worse. They're down 197 men, 8 T-62s, 7 BMP-3s and a handful of UAZ jeeps. Despite that, the enemy infantry did fight noticeably harder than they have done in previous missions. The enemy force here was a mix of airborne, special forces and uncons, all of whom appear to have been of veteran experience and none of whom surrendered. Their mortars in particular were a massive pain. This is partly due to my insistence of attacking down a single avenue of approach. If I had conducted a feint attack somewhere else, I could potentially have diverted attention away from my main effort and greased the wheels to some extent. That is something I considered at the time, but couldn't think of an alternate avenue of attack that was suitable, nor one of my own elements that wouldn't likely suffer just as heavily trying to beat a distraction. Regardless, the Marines have secured Azru Daraj and we can keep attacking towards Homs via Tal Kalak. Hope you all enjoyed this video and found it interesting. If you'd like to watch these early and support the channel, you can do so on Patreon and via YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next video.